Today, it's really hard to imagine what life was like before the internet. We've all come to be so dependent on it for our everyday lives. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick history of what data communications was like before the internet came along, and then a quick potted history of the internet itself starting from the 1960s. I'm going to start with a brief history of networking before the internet came along. This is a huge amount to cover in a very short time, but I'll see what I can do. So at around 1000 BC, at this time, most long-distance communications was for military purposes. Things like fire beacons, you'd set a fire to say the enemy is coming, or carrier pigeons to carry small pieces of information across enemy lines. The earliest recorded relay systems with horses were in Egypt and China about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and used all the way up until the 19th century for the mail delivery in the famous Pony Express across the United States. These early systems were pretty limited in the information that they could carry or the speed of delivery, and so around 2,000 years ago, in an attempt to get more information at greater speed, the first heliographs and flag systems, semaphores, and sending a whole symbol at the same time were first introduced. So they would transmit data at the speed of light over limited distances, but maybe 15 or 20 kilometers at a time. Basically simple encodings carried as positions of flags or position of a reflector. That's what a heliograph is. But really, the most significant advance didn't happen till the mid-1700s in France, just before the French Revolution, when someone called Claude Chappe started to introduce the semaphore telegraph, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. By the end of the 1800s, there was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, and then many other people beyond that started to develop and then produce and then commercialize the telephone, which really was the only significant worldwide network in use until the internet came along in the 1960s. Let me tell you a little bit about the semaphore telegraph of the 1700s. Claude Chappe's basic idea was that communication would take place between two hills, and he would build a tower on these, and there would be a mechanical arm called a regulator with two smaller arms called indicators, and he could move these to different positions. He could rotate it and send the arms at particular locations to communicate a symbol up to about 20 kilometers between two hills, and at the next hill would be another tower, and that would be used to symbol to the next hill, and so on. So in 1793, the French government built 15 stations, and then by 1804, they'd built a network to connect Paris to Dijon, which is over almost 400 kilometers. They could send a message every 20 seconds, and they could send messages across France in less than 30 minutes. Quite a remarkable feat. The basic idea was to encode symbols and send those symbols all in one character. And this kind of innovation really was part of a continuing trend of invention going back a couple of thousand years. 2000 BC, systems were used to signal a small set of predefined messages, so beacons to command particular predefined messages like the enemy is coming. By the 1600s, systems had been created to transmit arbitrary messages by encoding the alphabet in the positions of flags or the positions of arms on a tower. In the 1700s, numeric codes had been introduced for common words and phrases, and these could compress communication into quite an efficient manner. And also at that time, codes were introduced for control signals, allowing protocols to be born. Protocol symbols by 1800 were quite sophisticated. Initialization messages to clear the channel, error control for erase and resend, rate control to send faster or slower, flow control to say stop and wait or selectively repeat an errored message. So by the 1960s, the most advanced communication system in the world was the telephone network, a circuit switch network optimized for telephony. And that really was the state of affairs at that time. So when the first discussions started to take place in the 1960s, most notably by Licklider at MIT, he started to write memos and describe an intergalactic network where everyone on the globe would be connected and could access programs and data digitally at any site from anywhere. And this was really one of the founding ideas of what later became networking and the internet. And the technology was being developed in 3 places at that time. At RAND, Paul Barron was writing papers on data communication networks for the military, survivable networks. Kleinrock was describing queuing theory, and his first papers and his thesis on queuing theory were all published at that time. And Donald Davis in the UK at the National Physical Laboratory was starting to describe packet networks, and many people attribute the invention of the term packet switching to him. So all of these were happening at the same time. It was quite a remarkable coincidence. And at that time, time-sharing computers were just being deployed, and there were first long-distance connections. The first between 2 time-sharing computers in the northeast of the United States was in 1964. And around that time, many people, most notably Larry Roberts, were starting talking about a defense network for the DARPA, which is the US Department of Defense research arm. They would start talking of an ARPANET, a network that would interconnect computers across the United States, across the world. And some early prototypes started to appear. Most notably, there were 4 nodes interconnected in 1969. These were connecting UCLA, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and University of Utah, and the first messages were sent at this time. But it's important to note that at this time, the ARPANET was a single, closed, proprietary network. If you wanted to connect to it, you needed to connect via an internet message processor, or an IMP, and these were first deployed in the late 60s by a company called BBN. And during the early 1970s, based on these ideas, other networks started to appear that all worked very differently. They didn't connect to the ARPANET. They were all operating in separate islands. So in about 1974, DARPA, the Defense Department's research arm, sponsored work on connecting these networks together. And they conceived of the first network of networks, something they called interneting. This was first described by Vint Cerf, shown here, and Bob Kahn in a paper about TCP in 1974. The TCP of that time, although it called for reliable in-sequence delivery of data, it also included much of what we would call the network layer today. There was no separation into layers. There was no notion of a transport layer sitting above a network layer. There was no notion of congestion control. But by the end of the 1970s, they had separated apart, they teased apart TCP and IP into separate layers. And this made room for something they called UDP as an unreliable transport service that was originally for packetized voice. The first deployments of TCP happened in 1983. There was a flag day on the ARPANET when everybody had to move over from the old methods to this new TCP IP. Quite a brave thing to do, to change everybody over at the same time, something that would be unthinkable today, but really set the stage for the phenomenal growth of the internet during the 1980s. At that time, there were no more than about 200 hosts connected to the ARPANET, so it was a pretty small network. But by interneting, by connecting networks together, they could bring in all of the users that were connected to these other networks. And so through the creation of things like NSFNet to interconnect supercomputers across the United States, the creation of Cisco to build routers that would allow people to connect to these networks, standardization through the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, that all started at that time. And then by the end of the 1980s, there were over 100,000 hosts connected to the internet across all of these networks. So really quite a remarkable growth. But for many people, the internet hadn't really started at that point. For many people, the dawning of the internet happened around 1990 when Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in Switzerland invented the World Wide Web, and the first web browsers started to appear in about 1993. Of course, we all know the internet goes back much further than the World Wide Web. But during this time, following that creation of the first browser written by Marc Andreessen at Urbana-Champaign, it really led to bringing the internet to everybody across the world, not just to university students, not just to engineers, but within a year, over 1 million people around the world were using the web. I remember to this day where I was the first time I saw a web browser in 1993 when I was a graduate student. We knew immediately it was going to change everything. We didn't realize how huge that change would be, but within 10 years, Yahoo, Google, Amazon, eBay would all be on their way to becoming household names, and the internet was a part of our everyday lives. If you'd like to learn more about the history of networks, then I'd really encourage you to read the 3 references here. The first one is an early history of data networks leading up till the end of the 1700s, and gives you a wonderful description of the history all the way through telegraphs, heliographs, and many interesting developments at that time. The second one is an extremely interesting and profound description of the design philosophy of the internet itself. It was written by Dave Clark, who's a professor at MIT, and really gives you a detailed description of why the internet was created the way that it was. The last one is a brief history of the internet. It's a non-technical description of all the people, the many people who I didn't have time to mention today, who are involved in bringing together the pieces that form the internet as we know it today. That's the end of this video.